Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this policy exchange event on coalition government and the policy-making process. Neither of our speakers this evening really need any introduction. Both Oliver and Danny were intimately involved in the process that led to the creation of the coalition. And both of them were involved in the creation of the coalition programme. They both, in fact, were very heavily involved in the creation of their own party manifestos, and they're now at the very, very heart of government. Oliver as Minister for Policy at the Cabinet Office, and Danny as Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Now, in the true spirit of openness, transparency, and post-bureaucracy, most of this evening is really actually going to be about you and about questions and answers. But we are going to start off with a little bit from both of our guests. I think Oliver is going to talk, I think Danny perhaps will talk first a bit about how the negotiations worked, and a bit about how we got here. And Oliver is going to talk a little bit about how the coalition's arranged its affairs within government and how the machinery works now. And then we're going to throw it over to all of you. So without any further ado, I think we've only got most of our ministers until 7 o'clock. So, no further ado, over to you, Danny. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us and for arranging what is, I think, the first for Oliver and I, but probably won't be the last time that we talk about this to a public audience. Now, I don't have very much to say to begin with, because I think it's more useful to have the discussion, but I think it is just worth making some observations about the process that led us to form the coalition from a sort of policy point of view. I think both Oliver and I have spent some time studying each other's manifestos. I suspect probably more during the election campaign, looking for things to attack rather than things to agree about. But I think we probably both spotted that there were, as well as obviously differences where compromises had to be negotiated, also strong strands of ideological similarity, in the sense that, in terms of the emphasis that both Liberal Democrats and Conservatives put on localism and decentralisation and empowering individuals and communities, and indeed also empowering democratic institutions at a local level, that there is actually very strong areas of similarity both in some of the policies that we proposed, or where the policy outcomes were different, the motivation that led us towards them was quite similar. And I think that has fed its way through in the coalition agreement, particularly in some of the areas of public service reform, where driving greater accountability to people, whether that's through democratic mechanisms, which was, by and large, the sorts of mechanisms that Liberal Democrats have chosen, but also sometimes the Conservatives, or more market-based mechanisms or payment-by-results-based mechanisms. There's a similar kind of ideological underpinning there. Likewise, the emphasis that both parties give to on the environment, on civil liberties. These were issues that were pretty straightforward, actually, to negotiate when we came to draw up the coalition agreement, because again they came from a point of view of similarity. I think also on the economy, I mean, a lot of people are trying to point out differences, and of course differences were expressed during the election campaign. But actually, both parties had taken a view in the election campaign that, on the key issue of the deficit, that we needed to go further and faster and be more detailed, particularly than the previous government had been on that issue. So again, though some people think that was an area that was particularly difficult to negotiate, in fact, it's an area where we both come at it from, I think, in terms of the kind of intellectual foundations of it, quite a similar perspective. I'm sure in the questions you will want to tease out areas where it wasn't so easy, but I think for the moment I'm going to let it rest there and hand over to Oliver to say how it's been pretty easy in government.
Well, thank you. I've been cohabiting with Danny for some while now, and it's a very pleasurable experience. This is, I guess, an opportunity to reflect on what it was that we and others put together in the days following the completion of the original agreement, and indeed in parallel with the development of the programme for government. That is to say, the mechanics of coalition. I mean, neither do I have the time, nor do you have the patience to listen to a sort of tedious description of all these internal mechanics. I'm very happy to speak about those aspects of them, which are many that are public as well, very transparently. But I have really three, I'd be extremely interested to know whether Danny has the same reflection on this, but I have three reflections really on what we've discovered about coalition government. And everything I'm about to say is blindingly obvious, once said, but I have to admit that it hadn't occurred to me before. So it's just possible that I'm telling you something that you will think when I've told you that you've always thought, but which you don't yet think. The first point is that I think both of our parties actually had spent some time in opposition thinking about how you get away from what we call, the Conservatives call the sofa government approach that reached its nadir, the discussions around Iraq and Tony Blair and all that. And we were, I think, both of us determined to try to recreate something which certainly we called cabinet government. I suspect it had a similar name in the Liberal Democrat lexicon. Now, we'll never know, thank goodness, whether we would have fulfilled that noble ambition if we had found ourselves as a majority government. One of the things which has become clear to me is that we are fulfilling it, we will continue to fulfill it, and we have to fulfill it because coalition forces it. It's actually impossible to run hole-in-the-corner type decision-making in coalition. You can't do it because you've got to involve the other coalition partner in discussions. You've got to make sure that the discussion around Whitehall between ministries is sufficiently transparent to each and all to make sure that you're carrying the whole coalition with you. And that has created an impetus and locked us into a cycle of cabinet government, and Danny and I sit on almost all the cabinet committees. We both see this day by day. We actually have interesting and important discussions in cabinet committees that are properly minuted, the result in deliberative decision making. It's not as fast sometimes as the sofa government method. I think it's much sounder. So that's the first thing which I've discovered about coalition. It forces this, and it's been very welcome development. I suspect you get the same story from some of the senior civil servants as well. The second thing that I think we've discovered is that it is a very significant advantage if you're trying to take forward a very major programme of structural reform to improve the public services in the ways that Danny was just describing, and simultaneously to tackle the worst deficit this country's ever had, peacetime, if you have an opportunity to debate these things in a very open way, internally, but then actually to command a significant majority together in the House of Commons. I think it's a great deal easier, in fact, to tackle the issues that we are having to face as a nation because we have a government that actually has a stable working majority. And that's the sort of second thing that's really emerged, I think, how much better this position is than we would have been in if we had had a minority government or a very, very tiny majority to work with. And the third thing I think has become evident is that the process of dealing with issues as they arise actually benefits from the internal discussion, which in many respects similar outlooks, but in some respects different outlooks, force you to consider. We have to engage, not just in the process of cabinet committees and formal decision making, but actually in discussion and debate. We have to tease things out. And that is, of course, something that's extraordinarily good for getting to the bottom of things. And I have the feeling that this is a government which stands a better chance of understanding what it is doing, in the sense of understanding what the consequences of what it's doing really are likely to be, because of that pressure to debate things through and get to the bottom of things. And that's been a huge relief, really. To find that it's necessary to do something which I think, in fact, is hugely to the advantage both of the government and of the country, is a tremendous thing, because you're locked into it. You can't evade it. You can't move back to a position in which you just do something without thinking about it. There's an impossibility in coalition. You have to think about it enough to be able to persuade one another, and therefore you may well have thought enough about it to do it right. And that, I think, is a grounds for profound optimism. Those are my observations after 10 weeks of coalition. I hope that they're shared with Danny.
certainly are.
Lots to think about there. We're going to go over to questions and answers now. If you can put your hands up, and if you also say who you are and where you're from, that would be very helpful. I'm going to intrude by asking the first question, which is, Oliver, you, I think, first arrived in Downing Street in 1983. There's a kind of element of ashes to ashes for this. You arrived at a completely different time, and I wondered how you felt the centre had changed. It must be quite different working for Nick and Dave compared to working for Mrs. T. And this is kind of a question for both of you. How would you compare the way that you are running the centre to the way that Labour ran it? One of the things that people talk about what is the lower number of SPADs is the question about whether the centre has a smaller grip over the rest of government. But who wants to go first on that?
Well, I'll just make two observations. I can't say what it was like to work with Mrs. T for a very good reason. I think I was just going to secondary school at that point. I remember some of the consequences of Mrs. T, but that's another question altogether. I think that if you want to draw differences from the previous government, I think there are two things I'd say. One is it's based on good relationships in this government, and that seems to be a pretty fundamental and profound, but also important difference from how things were, at least if one reads memoirs and believes them, under the previous government. I mean, around the cabinet table, those people who sat around the negotiating table together, one of the reasons we were able to agree a coalition deal, even in areas where there wasn't sort of initial ideological similarity, was because there is a good chemistry and good working relationships between those individuals. Likewise between the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, and elsewhere. So being based on good relationships is one thing. And the second thing is just, in a sense, amplify what Oliver said, based on good evidence. I think that again is a difference. That when you are having to discuss things openly in cabinet committees and elsewhere, and persuade one another and reach a common view, actually looking at the evidence and understanding the evidence is something that you genuinely want to and have to do, and that leads to better decisions. So I think good relationships and good evidence are two of the key differences between ourselves and the previous government.
Yeah, to pick up from that and then come back to your question about 1983, I think, we haven't really ever talked about this quietly over a drink, but I think it is the case that the 3 or 4 rather high-pressure days when we were initially negotiating the agreement created a bond of trust which has actually lasted. And if the ladies and gentlemen from the media will forgive me, I think one of the bases for that was that more or less every TV camera, more or less every journalist in Britain seemed to want to know what it was we were negotiating about, but they never found out until we finished. And the fact that we were able to trust in one another enough to keep what we were saying to ourselves, I think actually began creating a foundation for something that's gone on. And I do think that the relationships are extraordinarily strong, actually, and there is an air of, does it sound very old-fashioned, of courtesy and decorum in our proceedings, which I think actually matters quite a lot. It's much easier to make sensible decisions about the fate of a nation if you are doing so in a calm and decorous fashion. I've seen examples of Danny chairing meetings with extraordinary iron will to make sure that everything proceeds properly, and that's just how it should be. I wouldn't use the word ashes to ashes. First of all, I don't accept it as a description of the 80s, I certainly don't accept it as a description of now. I should tell you, however, that there was a very, very surprising feature of our country, which is that when I walked back into the door of Downing Street as a sort of slightly more elevated apparatchik than I'd left it in 1986, I was greeted by the same person that I had seen on leaving the door in 1986. Literally the same person. And in fact, it took me some while to realise why he seemed very familiar. And then the following morning, I went into what was still the bizarre setup that our predecessors had established in sort of bowels of 12 Downing Street. And the very first person I met, who was then in a different position, had been one of the garden room girls in 1986. So I conclude that there is a great deal of continuity in that building.
Very good. So over to questions and answers, if you want to put up your hands. I think Should we start with, there's a question on the very front row here, and there's a microphone coming to you, if you just hold on for 1 second. I think what we might do is take them in, say, groups of 3 or something like that.
Daniel Johnson, editor of Standpoint magazine. Oliver, you will remember, I too was at the Centre for Policy Studies when you were working for Keith Joseph back in those early days, 1980s. And what I wanted to ask you was, all governments to some extent are coalitions. This one is a formal coalition. That one was a coalition, if you like, of wets and dries, or Thatcherites and other types of Tories. How do they compare? I mean, you know, how do relationships between different wings of the same party, who may differ bitterly and sometimes very acrimoniously on matters of policy, how does that kind of negotiation, which went on in the 80s, differ from the kind of negotiations you have to conduct now with 2 quite separate parties, which may well, by the time of the next election, be fighting again separate election campaigns? Indeed, one has to assume that that probably will be the case. And we know from wartime experience, that was the last coalition we had, that no sooner was the war over than Churchill was accusing Attlee of trying to introduce the Gestapo, and you know, it was an extremely acrimonious election campaign, actually. So anyway, I'm just asking, you know, how does that experience compare with the present?
Okay, there was another question. There's about halfway at the back. If you can try and keep all my questions really tight.
I'll do my best now. Adrian Fluck. Oliver mentioned the need to be, the debates to be transparent. To my mind, that's very laudable. But do we think the opponents of the coalition, and I'm not putting the media as opponents, but do we think the media will respect that modern way of doing business? Otherwise, we're going to end up with a he said, she said narrative for the next 4 years and 10 months.
And one more question, which is at the very back there, lady with the
Hello, Nicola Bates from Elwood and Hatfield. Really fascinated to hear how it's working in government. What I'd like to understand more is how you are developing the mechanisms back with your respective parties. Saw a really good account of what the Liberal Democrats did during the coalition, but saw perhaps a little less about what the Conservatives did. So how are you going to use that experience and develop it for the future?
Very good.
Sure. You're right, Daniel, of course, that every party is, every great party contains a spectrum of opinion and is joined together by the things that join it, but differentiated by the things that people differ about. And so, to some extent or other, every government is a coalition. I see that. I think the difference, if you like, is the difference between marriage and friendship. In a marriage, you're kind of committed, and therefore some of the inhibitions are removed, and there's a terrible tendency, therefore, for some frictions to exhibit themselves. Whereas in a friendship, you're more concerned constantly to ensure that you're behaving very properly to one another, in order to avoid ceasing to see one another, which would be sad. And I think the sort of slight edge of formality, not necessarily in interpersonal relationships between one-on-one, but between groups of people from different parties sitting around the same table, actually sort of militates towards decorousness and the kind of proper government that I was talking about. I think Adrian's question is a very good one and relates to that. You know, will over time the public, the media, other politicians accept the degree of open admission of compromise and discussion that we have so far engaged in? Well, I don't know, but I think so far the omens are enormously good, and I think it's in tune with the times. I think people want politicians not to be simply careering down a particular path, forgetting all else. I think they want people to work with one another, and I think they accept that if you work with one another, you will have discussion, debate, and compromise. So I think it's entirely viable. How do we connect with our own parties? Well, Danny will speak for himself and the Dems. On our own side, my overwhelming sense, obviously the thing I know best is my own constituency and the activists in my own constituency, is that there's a huge enthusiasm for this project. You know, the constant dialogue that goes on. I was discussing this very issue with a very large group of constituents on Friday evening in the party, not other constituents voters, but my own party activists. And there's a huge interest and a huge willingness to make it work. And I think that's partly because they realise that actually the only way we're going to get some things which this country desperately needs and which we as a party are totally committed to happen is in this arrangement. So I don't think there's the problem we might have thought that there would have been on that front at all.
Just add a couple of things to that. In answer to Adrian's question, I think that part of the answer to that is how are the public understanding the coalition. And during the election campaign, I knocked on an awful lot of doors in Inverness and elsewhere, and one of the things that people said more than anything else was, you know, we would just like politicians to sit down and work together. We can see that the country has enormous problems, enormous economic problems, enormous problems in a whole number of other areas. And instead of just shouting at one another, why don't you sit down and work together, work out your differences, and then deliver the changes that you want to make. And actually, I think there's an enormous amount of public interest in the coalition, because finally they're seeing two groups of politicians from different parties doing what frankly anyone does in their normal life, in their workplace, in their family, which is sitting down with people with whom they have different views and hammering it out and working out what to do. And that's what we're doing, basically. And so I think that if the interpretation of that becomes, you know, he said, she said, let's look at the latest, you know, compromise or split or whatever, I think it's just completely out of tune with the way in which people understand the coalition. And I think that the public understanding, I hope, will drive perhaps a slightly more mature reflection on the way that we're carrying out our business. In terms of how you deal with parties, I remember the first meeting we had when we were discussing the coalition, negotiating the coalition, and I said, well, perhaps we ought to start by understanding our internal processes. And so I asked William Hague to describe the Conservatives' internal process. He's got a very, very short answer indeed. And then I then spent about 15 minutes describing the Liberal Democrats' internal processes and the range of committees and so on. And so there's obviously some different traditions in that respect. But I think that in both cases, what is important is good regular communication, a good regular flow of information and discussion and engagement between those who are involved in government and those who are involved with the party, trying where one can within the bounds of proper government and collective responsibility to ensure that there aren't sort of nasty surprises on either side around the corner. The sort of basic things that you would expect to do. I don't think it's rocket science, but I think it's something that we all have to continually work at to make sure that communication is good.
Very good. Some more questions. Seth, about halfway up from the back there, and then the lady next to him in that row there. I'm going to live the phone.
Thanks. Seth Thomas from Citibank. You mentioned New York 1983. How about 1946? 2 years before the London Olympics, and the Attlee government then is facing huge fiscal consolidation and need for, and also the defining relationship between the state and the citizen. Those are two big policies for you as well. How are you going to reconcile the two?
Another question, just next to you.
Mary Riddell from the Daily Telegraph. I take absolutely the point that you've both made about the harmonious working relationship of the coalition, and indeed about the friction in the previous governments and the destructive nature of that. I wondered in a way if it might behove you to fall out a bit more. I mean, whether there is a sort of sense that, I think there may be a sort of public sense that that it's so lacking acrimony in the arrangement. To take one example, the Academies Bill going through Parliament at the moment, there has been considerable criticism about the lack of legislative scrutiny. And one would have thought that legislation like that, in a with a broad-based coalition, would perhaps have been scrutinised from behind the scenes, and that there might have been more checks and balances along the way. I suppose what I'm asking briefly is, are you falling over backwards to get along so much that the legislative process may be compromised, or indeed the public may think that the two parties have become entirely homogenised?
And there was another question, Lisa. Just back there a bit.
Peter Barnes. It's expanding Mary's question a little bit. To what extent do you think that the coalition has changed the dynamics of the relationship, on the one hand between government and parliament, and on the other hand between ministers and civil servants? And on the first point, can we expect that the truncation of the parliamentary scrutiny of the Academies Bill is a one-off, or will it be setting a precedent for the future? And on the second, will civil servants be more or less involved in the policy-making process than they have been under a single-party government?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who sees Oliver and I sitting together on a platform and describes that product as homogenised is perhaps somewhat misunderstanding something. And you're not going to tempt us to fall out a bit more in public when we don't necessarily do so in private. Though we do occasionally, obviously. And I'm not sure I accept the criticism of the parliamentary process either in this case. I think that what we have is something which is a political priority for the coalition, where enhancing freedoms for schools was something that was important to both Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, and this bill is a first step in that process. And I think it is right and proper that the government is able to push forward its political priorities. The relationship with Parliament, I guess, in a hung Parliament, which is what we have with a coalition government, Parliament is probably more important. And you know, we've implemented the right reforms, which means there's more time available in Parliament for backbenchers. So I think probably more statements in Parliament. Certainly the debate last night suggested that's what there was demand for. So I don't accept that that's going in the wrong direction. I think that's probably going in the right direction, actually. Maybe I also would like to make observations about ministers and civil servants. For my part, I have no way of judging how that relationship worked under the previous government. For my part, it's a very good relationship, and one where I certainly get extremely good advice, but you know, make decisions for myself.
Yes, maybe I can take on from where Danny ended and just deal with the second half of Peter's question, which is very interesting. I think that there has been a marked shift in the relationship between politicians and officials as a result of coalition in two important respects, both of which I think are highly constructive. The first is that because we were forced to write everything down, we literally, Danny and I spent, I don't know, what was it, 3 days or something, trying to document all the significant areas of policy in the coalition programme for government. Even those where we were totally agreed, we didn't need to have an agreement about them because we disagreed, we just needed to document. But in the course of that, of course, we also teased out all the things where we did have disagreements and found solutions to those. Now, the upshot, we thought, certainly I thought, would be that it would be very helpful for the politicians. What hadn't occurred to me, but has now become clear to me, is it's also extremely helpful for officials, and indeed for ministers in their dealings with officials, because actually it's impossible for the Department of Paperclips to produce the paperclip bill that they had been thinking of for the last 23 years, and persuade a minister that that's actually the only thing the minister can do, because the minister is bound in by a series of agreements that are there and are published as the programme for government, and officials recognise that, and therefore the balance of power, so to speak, between the politicians and the officials shifts. And we have a programme, and officials are now helping us carry it out. Now, the result of that, allied to the orderly government that I was describing, the fact of things going through Cabinet Committee in the proper way and being discussed seriously in a minute and so on, is that the officials are trading power over luckless and unguided ministers for actually having to carry out a government programme, but doing so in an orderly fashion and having their advice being listened to properly by ministers who know what it is they're aiming at, but want to know how best to do it. And I think that relationship, therefore, is enormously better than one reads about. For the past, of course, officials are much too discreet to tell us anything about it themselves, but one reads the diaries, and also, indeed, better than I experienced in the 1980s. I apologise, Mary, if you object to the fact that there isn't any acrimony, but I'm afraid we're going to try and go on disappointing you all the way to 2015. I personally hate acrimony. I don't think it generates any kind of good anywhere in the world, and it should be avoided. You can have disagreement. We have disagreement. Don't be under an illusion. It is not, I'm sure Danny would say the same thing, it is not the case that we solve problems by pretending they don't exist. Where we disagree, where there might be a disagreement, we have all sorts of mechanisms for doing this, both informal and formal. We sit down, we talk it through, we pull no punches, and we agree. And that way we avoid acrimony because we don't have sort of smouldering resentment sitting around which nobody's got the courage to talk about. And I think that's the right way of doing business. Most fundamental, profound question about deficit and structural reform. How do we reconcile trying to tackle deficit, which is the country's most urgent problem, with trying to achieve structural reform of our public services, which is the country's deepest problem? And the answer is they go totally together. The cure of the deficit is an urgent necessity in the short term, but the only sustainable path for public finances in the long term is one that depends on public services, which are vastly more efficient, do much better at getting more for less over the long term, because they are structured in the right way, because they are accountable to the people that they're serving and not to vast bureaucracies and targets. You can't ultimately, I believe, in a modern liberal democracy, get to sustainable public finances with levels of public service that the public will buy into without having a structural reform that moves away from a top-down bureaucratic model to a bottom-up democratically accountable model. And that is therefore just the second phase, if you like, of putting the public finances in proper order. But of course it also has huge additional advantages in the sense of freeing up innovation, giving people a sense that they can do things and run their own lives, bringing in communities, the whole big society agenda and so on. So luckily we are at a conjuncture where it is absolutely necessary both to put into practice short-term measures and long-term measures. And I say luckily because the short-term measures we would much prefer to have avoided, but the long-term measures are made all the more necessary by the short-term exigencies, and that means that we can't deviate from the structural reforms which we desperately want to take forward.
Good. More questions? And there's a gentleman in the second row here.
Mark Adams from Foresight Consulting. You actually started to answer the question I've been trying to ask, which is about the dispute resolution mechanisms. You said it's a combination of informal, I can imagine what those are, cozy chat around the fireside and so on. But what are the formal ones, where the two coalition partners are ideologically opposed on something? Clearly the Conservatives are the biggest element of the coalition, so I imagine some kind of block vote system for ultimately deciding this. But I'm very, very interested in what those formal mechanisms are for resolving such disputes.
And there was a question, I think, gentleman halfway down the side.
Morse from the Conservative Environment Network, though my question is more about economics. Much of the public spending cuts will have to inevitably be felt in the regions where the state currently dominates the economy in the north and so on. But at the moment, perhaps not coincidentally, most productive sectors of the economy are located in the southeast. And if there is to be a speedy economic recovery, necessary both for the country and perhaps for the success of this government, the growth is probably going to come from the south. And what is the coalition thinking of doing in order to make sure this doesn't further increase inequalities between the regions of the UK?
One more, if we take a question from Jeremy, who's in the fourth row.
Thanks, Jeremy Thomas. Perhaps I might fairly describe myself as coalition conservative. It's an old term that might be given new life by recent events. This Conservative Liberal coalition, like the three others that have gone before it, is going to have to lead the country through some very difficult times. I think we all accept that. Every other Conservative Liberal coalition that we've had in this country has been stabilised by some form of electoral understanding regarding future elections. Seeing that our two parties are going to be working together very closely over the next 5 years, one wonders how much sense does it really make for us to have to fight each other all the way across the country. I realise that this is perhaps not the least delicate of subjects, but should we necessarily preclude some form of understanding, seeing how much we have achieved so far together and seeing how much we hope to achieve in the future?
Good question. What do you do?
Can I deal with the question about the public spending cuts in the north? I mean, and I'll come back to the question about electoral understanding, to which I don't think there's a need. I think there's a need to behave politely to one another, but I don't think there's a need for. We are independent parties with our own traditions and our own candidates in local and other elections, and I think we will carry on that way. I don't think there's any need for such understandings. What we need to do is maintain the harmonious relationships that allow the government to go forward in the way that it is. The question about public spending and the differential impact across the country is a very important one, but I'm not sure I accept the premise of it about where growth is going to come from. I mean, you could, I suspect, some of the very efficient manufacturing industry in the north of England, upon whose exports we are hoping to depend, would disagree with that. And in a sense, I think I'd come back to a point about the way in which the way the British economy developed over the last 30 years and maybe before that was unbalanced. Unbalanced geographically, it was unbalanced in terms of which industries were particularly favoured by government, financial services being an obvious example. And part of our economic objective is to deliver growth in a more balanced and sustainable way. Now, you quite rightly highlight one of the challenges, which is that there are some parts of the country which are more dependent currently on the public sector than other parts of the country. I come from one such part of the country in the Highlands of Scotland, and we've already identified a number of measures that we think will help to deal with that, to promote economic growth in those areas, and to try and mitigate some of the impacts that are felt as well. So whether it's national insurance cuts for small businesses focused in some of the regions that are more dependent on the public sector, whether it's the establishment of a regional growth fund, which will be particularly focused on areas where the impacts are potentially going to be highest. We're identifying measures already that we think can help to ameliorate at least, and hopefully to tackle that problem. But I also think that one of the things I spoke about earlier, that the emphasis we have on localism, on empowering people, on empowering communities, actually is very relevant to that question too. You know, Britain is I think the second most centralised state in the European Union after Malta. We hope to leave it significantly less centralised than we found it. Hopefully a great deal less centralised than we found it, so that initiative at a local and community and regional level, whether that's in the sphere of economics or business formation or social life of communities, is enabled and able to flourish as it should. And just one example of that in the area you're talking about is the abolition of regional development agencies, which have a sort of top-down approach to driving growth in regions, and their replacement with the local enterprise partnerships that we're establishing between to form between local authorities and local businesses, where the sort of driving force, if you like, of local economic development will be in local hands, based on geographical areas which are decided upon by people locally, with ways of working decided upon by people locally, with objectives and strategies decided on by local authorities and businesses locally. And I think that in itself will have a tremendously dynamic effect, which I hope will help to answer the problem that you've raised also.
As Danny's dealt with the other two, let me deal with the question of the reconciliation procedures, and I'm not telling you anything secret. In the spirit of transparency, all the cabinet committee structures so on are published on the website. And basically the way the formal process works is that each of the committees of cabinet are structured in a traditional fashion. That's to say, the relevant ministers are present from the relevant ministries to deal with the topic. The Home Affairs has ministers whose portfolios deal with Home Affairs, and so forth. Danny and I are present in each of these committees, but it's not the case that they're structured around coalition dynamics, so to speak. They're structured around portfolios. But each of them has a chairman from one of the two coalition partners, and a deputy chairman from the other coalition partner, that is the concession, so to speak, to coalition dynamics. And there is a rule which is hasn't actually yet ever been formally triggered, it has to be said, but there is a rule which is that either the chair or the deputy chair can trigger a reference in the first place to a sort of working group that Danny and I co-chair, which is there to seek a resolution to a coalition problem should it occur. And in the event of not being able to, or in the event of needing to bless something that comes out of the working group, a reference to the coalition committee, which is not like any of the other cabinet committees, also published on the web, and in which, as you'll see, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister co-chair, and as well as Danny and myself, there are a number of other senior colleagues around the cabinet table represented, but in equal numbers from the two coalition partners, and that is the place where a formal resolution, if one is needed, is arrived at, and then that's remitted to cabinet for final approval by cabinet. So there's a quite elaborate process, which I think the origin of that actually is attributable to Jim Wallace. I think it was he who came up with that extremely ingenious idea, which we quickly adopted, and it means that it's impossible for the minority partner in the coalition ever to be outnumbered at a committee, because should they be outnumbered and should the party, the Democrat Party, feel that something is happening which as a result they don't like, there's simply a reference to a place where they're not outnumbered anymore, and therefore this never happens. So we haven't had any such formal references yet. And I expect that it's rather like, you know, when Nigel Lawson put a floor under the price of, was it British Gas shares or something, when they were falling through the bottom. Of course, they never reached the floor because everybody knew that they would be worth the floor because Nigel Lawson Treasury would have bought them, and therefore they hovered above. I think in the same way, the fact of this reference system means it will probably never need to be invoked.
A few more questions. There's a gentleman in a white shirt in that row.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Lloyd. My question is about trust and the media, and I wanted to go back to what Oliver said at the beginning, which was about the negotiations, which was that, I think more or less quoting him, it really helped that the material issues didn't leak to the media in the negotiations, so there was trust. And my question is, bearing in mind you are undoubtedly in a honeymoon period, especially as far as the media is concerned, and possibly the country. Do you think it's right that, despite having perhaps a policy of openness generally, which is a good thing, that it is appropriate and would be good if you had a policy of secrecy in terms of your discussions, so that you didn't have this situation that was very common, which was there was a lot of leaking and briefing against people. This is for many, many years in different governments that actually goes some way to undermine it. So your relationship with, therefore, with the media might be more secret than it has been in past governments.
This question directly behind you.
Hi, Ollie Grenda. Congratulations on everything achieved so far. Just a quick question to Oliver, really, which is, given that the fate of the minority party often in a coalition partnership is a difficult one in terms of being heard and understood by the time the party reaches another election, do you have any advice for those of us who are Liberal Democrats in terms of how to overcome that? And then, Danny, what do you think of that advice, please?
It was very good,
Yeah, just a very quick question, mainly addressed to Oliver Letwin. The argument against electoral reform has normally been that it doesn't produce strong governments, and strong governments are good. But what you said at the start sounded as though you sort of discovered a better way, and I wondered whether this was actually changing attitudes within the Conservative administration, now maybe not on the backbenchers, towards the prospect of coalition being a more typical way of governing the UK than the governments we've been used to in the past.
Okay, so I'll go for any questions here. Oliver, do you go?
Well, I've got to go first, and I can take your advice. Yes, exactly. I guess I've got to answer the second question first. I certainly have no advice for another party. I've never been able to say anything in any way beneficial to my own party about how to win elections, so why should I be able to offer advice to the Liberal Democrats? I do think that there's a serious point underneath, which is that we are very conscious of the need to play fair and not to have any surprises. Those are the two basic principles of cooperation. Unless it's fair between us and unless there are no surprises, it can't work. And that's one of the reasons why I think you may have noticed that the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister often do things together. And there's been a very considerable, and here we are, there's a very considerable effort to make sure that the fact that there are more Conservative ministers than there are Liberal ones, inevitably, does not mean that the limelight is always being hogged by one party rather than the other. And I think actually the advice is to us, not to the Liberal Democrats. We have to go and do that. We have to go the last mile to make sure that the Liberal Democrats have a decent, Liberal Democrat ministers have a decent showing, a decent chance to get before the public, and that's a principle on which we have to operate. It'll be very interesting to see whether Danny accepts that view. I think on the question of the secrecy of discussions, yeah, I think that one of the things that's happened so far is, and I pray and hope that this will maintain itself, is that there has been incredibly little by way of people leaking or briefing against one another. I think that's fantastically important. And in an odd kind of way, it comes back to my answer to Daniel much earlier, the fact that this is a friendship rather than a permanent marriage, I suspect makes people much more hesitant to engage in tactics which I don't think are the right tactics in any government. But here it's much less likely to occur, I think, and that's very, very welcome. Which brings us to the very interesting question, is this in fact the best way of doing things? Charles and I said a long time ago, when asked about the French Revolution, that it was too early to tell. And I think that's the position we're in now. I hope we may have the chance to come back 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, in our bath chairs, or whatever, my case anyway, and offer you a profound reflection on what the answer to that question really is or isn't. Well, it's very pleasant to spend an hour of our honeymoon here together with you. I mean, I think that, yes, of course, the dynamics of individual ministers and the publicity they get as well is very important. And as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, I find Conservative ministers are very interested in what I have to say, particularly at the moment. But in the end, like all governments, we're going to be judged by what we do. We're going to be judged by whether we have achieved things that we set out. We have published a coalition agreement which contains strong elements of Liberal Democrat thinking, strong elements of Conservative thinking, and strong blends of the two. And people at the end of the day, in 2050, when we have another election, and we'll both be, as parties, putting ourselves forward, will judge us all on, did we solve the big problems that we said we were going to solve? Did we reduce the deficit in the way that we promised to? Did we deliver the spending, the savings, the spending cuts that we have to make in a way that did provide more for less, in a way that did ensure that outcomes were protected as best we could for people, that in a way that delivered the structural reforms in public services that mean that there is greater accountability to individuals, to communities, and all those things. And so, in a sense, it's like any other government. We get on and do what we've got to do. We try and do it as competently and as clearly and as unacrimoniously as we possibly can. But in the end, we will stand or fall by what we achieve, not by mechanisms we establish to ensure that someone gets publicity here or there. That's the judgment that voters will make. That's the way I think all of us, certainly I and Oliver, approach what we're doing. And I think that's that's the only way, as a coalition government or not, to approach the job. I have to say to the person who asked about electoral reform, it hasn't changed my attitude to electoral reform.
Can I just echo something that Dan just did? I think that is actually a very, very important point. I don't mean this in a sort of partisan spirit. Well, I suppose that partly do, but I don't mean it in a partisan spirit, but it's a genuine observation. I think there was a tendency, at least at the tail end of the last government, to imagine that they were running a magazine rather than a government. And we're trying to run a government and not a magazine. And Danny's absolutely right. At the end, what matters to us, both for our self-interest and for the nation, is that we are judged to have done the things we needed to do. And that's worth 1,000 things on the way. And there is a real air, actually. I'm maybe this will sound pious, but as I sit at meetings discussing really serious and difficult things under what are really very difficult circumstances, I'm over and over again reminded that actually this is a government that has a purpose, has a plan, it's aiming somewhere. We want to do something. We think it's the right thing to do. You know, these are old-fashioned virtues, but they're fantastically important.
And if I could just add one thing to that, I know the clock struck 7, so I'm not sure we can take any more questions, and we're going to have to go before the chair has to break the bad news to everybody. I think it's also worth saying that that sense of the seriousness of the times in which we live was one of the key things that enabled us, I think, to succeed in forming the coalition in the first place. That, I mean, when the Prime Minister said at Prime Minister's Questions that there is one party that has created this mess and is refusing to take responsibility for it, and two parties that have come together to clean it up, there was a very strong element of that which actually drove us together in the first place to form the coalition, and which, therefore, that spirit kind of animates the seriousness of purpose, which Oliver has, I think, absolutely rightly described.
Very good. Well, Danny's right. Their coalition political minds are gesturing furiously for the back, because you're both supposed to be voting in the House of Commons in like 2 minutes' time. But thank all of you for coming. Thank you for your very interesting, insightful questions. Oliver, Danny, fascinating insight into the new government. We shall have you back perhaps in 5 years' time and see if all these things have stood the test of time. But it only really remains for me to suggest that we thank our speakers in the conventional way. Thank you very much.